Good afternoon. Hello. Welcome. There's just a few more people joining. Good to see you. Oh, there's quite a lot more people joining now. Nice to see you. Um, Welcome to Friday afternoon lunch and learn. Looking forward very much to chatting with a friend and colleague who I've not met in person, but we've done a lot of work together online. And he, like myself, is passionate about running and also is bringing some really good programs together for himself and for his clients in how he's incorporating breath work into his training. So he'll be here to share some ideas with you. We're going to keep it very informal, so please feel free as as we go through the session just to jump in, ask questions. You can ask questions in the chat, or it's a small group, so you can also ask questions. Just raise a hand, raise a virtual hand, and then you can unmute yourself and ask questions. So do stop at any time. So I'd like you to introduce you to Kevin McQuaid. Kevin, thanks for joining. Thanks for agreeing to do today's lunch and learn session. How are you doing?
Um, I've got a cold. So Gray and I were just laughing about the healthiness of breath coaches. But actually, it's not too bad. So my voice sounds a lot worse. It was a lot worse the last couple of days. I went for a run this morning, which is why it's like this, actually. So anyway, I'm good. I'm well. I'm happy.
That's the important thing, that you're happy and well.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were just having a laugh because I've had a dodgy stomach all week. Kev's got a cold, so it's like, yeah, this is going to be a really good session. If
But,
we keel over,
yeah.
somebody just jump in and start talking. We met back in lockdown again. It's another lockdown story, and did our training together with the Oxygen Advantage.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit how you got involved in the breathwork and Oxygen Advantage, Kevin.
So I actually got interested in breathwork in more detail around 2016. Which I was just talking with Gray about the podcast I listened to. I listened to another podcast with this guy, a chap called Leo Ryan, in 2016, talking about how I've never been asthmatic, but he was very severely asthmatic. And it changed his journey from being very asthmatic. He went to, I think his mum took him to see a Buteyko practitioner in Dublin in whenever it was, a long time ago. And it completely changed his ability to move. And I, at the time, had started running again. So my preferred distance is marathons. And I then I was curious about breath code. So I kind of looked at Wim Hof and went down this rabbit hole like lots of people do around breath and how I could use it to improve my running. And so from a very personal point of view, I kind of fell down this rabbit hole and decided. So I've been a primary school teacher for the last 11 years. So I've taught full time for not the last year, but the 10 before that. And I always knew I wanted to move into something else. So when I found my running had become I can't say that it's solely down to breath work, but it was certainly one of the key instruments that I used to improve my running times. I'm 50 in a couple of weeks. And so I've started running faster than I did 20 odd years ago. So I certainly think that's got something to bear on it. I then began to look at different modalities as for breath and breath coaching. And for those of you who have gone on that journey, you may well be aware of just how broad it is, how confusing it can be, and how many different options you have. I was looking at Wim Hof and I decided that it was too limiting in what I wanted to do in terms of the way. So I'd done the fundamentals course and I just thought, okay, I want something a bit broader than that, which brought me to Patrick McEwen and OA. And I really liked the focus on movement and physical activity, but equally the focus on general health. So I liked the fact he'd come from his own journey through Buteyko, and then he'd seen an area that he wanted to focus on, which was performance. And one of the things that spoke quite loudly to me is the within running, and this is still the case that I feel, if you pick up a running book on how to run, I would challenge you to find much information on how to use your breath, which I find incredible because There is loads of information on how you train your physiology in terms of anaerobic, aerobic, so your energy systems, food, different session structures, kit, all this stuff, but nothing really on the breath, which I always found absolutely bonkers. And then when I so I trained with OA, I qualified as a running coach about a year ago, I suppose. But what I found really interesting was you've got two main schools of thought within running, I suppose. You've got the club ends, which is very much focused on sets, reps, sessions, competitive running, nothing really about the breath. And then you've got the more holistic chi running side of things, where there's a really, really great understanding of the breath, but probably a little bit more distant from the structured running sessions that you'll see at a running club. And for me, I'm like, well, actually, there's got to be a middle way, because I like running quite competitively. But equally, I want to be able to use as much as I possibly can, if I'm doing that, to help support my running, and especially as I'm getting older. And there aren't many runners who, when you show them something that's going to enable them to run to a better degree, they're not going to embrace it. So I find this quite fascinating. So you'll go to a running club and you'll have a session, and there won't be much talk about breath at all. I was being coached last year by an ex Bowerman runner who was a really good, and I was saying, did you get any coaching on breathwork when you were part of Bowerman, which is one of Nike's top end elite? And he was like, no, not really, which I found staggering. But that does seem to be the general experience of lots of people who run through clubs. They don't get exposed to breathwork. If you try to do your own research, so you buy books, you don't get exposed to breathwork, which to me, as I said, I think is staggering. So that's then took me down this journey of thinking, okay, so how can I learn about using breath and marry that with running and deliver that to athletes to enable them to take it on board to improve their running. I don't think I've gone off on a tangent, but I've answered your question and started talking.
No, not at all, not at all.
So
you say you qualified as a coach about a year ago. What was that? So that's England Athletics, or was it what type of coach?
So when lockdown happened, I wasn't a member of a running club. So when I started running a lot in the early noughties, I did New York Marathon in 2004, I think, but I was never, the running club scene never appealed to me, because I always felt it looked a little bit stuffy, which is, I'm saying it's completely unfair, but that was my impression, rightly or wrong. So I would run with running crews in London, which felt more informal, closer to what I wanted to do. But when lockdown happened, I felt I could do something for clubs, so I could join the club. So one of the local clubs to me is Serpentine. They have budget to pay for people to qualify as coaches. And because I've taught for so long, actually, coaching and teaching, it's pretty much the same. The content that you deliver is what differentiates you once you know how to teach or coach. So actually doing the qualification was great, because the thing that I do that I enjoy the most, I coach the juniors, so the 10 to 16-year-olds on Tuesdays, and I love it. And it's really interesting doing breast stuff with those kids as well, because you have children who are more open to it, so to speak. So I qualified as a running coach. And then I've been specifically over the last year been really focusing on delivering breath and running from what I've experienced myself, what's benefited me, but also kind of as I've picked up stuff and learned about it. And equally, once I qualified as an OA instructor, I kind of did it, and again, this might be normal for people, I'd gone almost the kind of the wellness route before understanding the scientific route. So I like Patrick's focus on science, but I really didn't have a background of how the respiratory system works, how our cardiovascular system works. So I've kind of gone away and looked at, okay, so what does science tell us? How can I then match that with the work that Patrick's done? And actually Wim Hof, if you read his book, he's quite clear about the science and how it supports it. And then how I could and the reason I wanted to do that is because when you are talking about breath and the physiological benefits it can have for people, I wanted to have an understanding and try to deliver it in language that was accessible. And also, if I was challenged on something, I wanted to be able to say, actually, I don't know. I need to go away and research that for myself. Or, okay, this is what I understand to be the case. Maybe we need to learn more, but this is why I'm asking you to do what you're doing. This is the impact it has. So what I have found in the last, I would say 6 months, is that I see breath with running in 3 very distinct areas. You have pre-running, you have when you run, and then you have post-run. And the thing that I've discussed, and again, with runners, you will find that you'll get different levels of engagement. You'll get different levels of people wanting to try something on an ongoing basis, which then brings me back to Leo Ryan, the chap that I've been, I listened to a podcast with him recently, and he has found that, which I agree with, the most effective breathing techniques for runners tend to be recovery. But they're not necessarily exciting. So you might not get so much buy-in, but they are probably the most effective things. So looking at this, it then has made it easier for me with the runners I work with to block breathing techniques that I'm giving them and cutting it down into those 3 areas allows people to try different things that they want at different times. So the easiest for a lot of runners, not the easiest, the most exciting thing they want to do is what Patrick would call sharp fit pre-run, where you're doing mini breath holds, walking, sprinting, and you get an immediate bounce from it. So runners love it because they'll do that, they'll see a response, and they'll be like, oh, right, great, this is great, I want to do this. So that's quite easy to get a buy-in with. I'll come back to that. I just lost my train of thought then. I'm really sorry.
It's all right.
So that's it. The other thing is time. So if you're coaching runners, they are going to have a limited amount of time. And I found this, that if you give people a program where you're trying to get them to do breathing practices outside of when they're running, so kind of pre-running or recovery, you've really got to have a conversation with them to understand how are they going to integrate that into their day. Because with all the best will in the world, if they're not actually, like, I don't know what any of your people who you're coaching are running, lots of runners just want to go out the door, run, finish their run, done. That's it. They don't really want to do a lot more than that. So you need to be quite cute about how you develop this with them. And one of the things I've found is building trust over time allows you to kind of expand the time that they're willing to give to you and what you're going to suggest to them, because we're not with people all the time. And actually, the more you do breath around your running, the better it's going to become. But then people need to be willing to buy into that. So the 3 areas in terms of pre-run, run itself, and post-run. So pre-run, I'll look at with runners, training I always find it hard to say this, your inspiration muscles. So I can't say it, inspiratory breathing muscles. So that could be something that they're doing when they're getting up. They're doing very deliberate inhales and exhales slowly through the nose. And they're hands on their sides. And that whole thing where they're feeling their diaphragm going up and down. Alison McConnell is somebody who has spent a lot of time and research on inspiratory muscle trainers. So she does this using a device that you put in your mouth, and she had great success with rowers, with swimmers. But runners don't really think about training their diaphragm. And actually, you know when your running's done because your breathing's done. And that may be because your breathing muscles are tired. So actually, the more you train the intercostals and the diaphragm through deliberate, slow breathing, inhale, exhale, the more effective those muscles are going to be when you're running long. So you're doing a marathon. And very interestingly, there was in America in 1968, the best ever Olympic USTAF Olympic result was in the 68 Olympics in Mexico. And it was at altitude. And the Olympics employed a guy called Caws, who was a choir master who became a practitioner who worked in VA with emphysema patients, so sorting out their breathing. He went and worked with the American track team, and he would do a lot of work on their breathing mechanics before they'd run. So forced exhales, working on their inspiratory muscles. And I don't think it's any coincidence, they then went away and had the best track result they've ever had to this day. And lots of the athletes talked about, they called him Dr. Breath. So I think that's really key, thinking about how athletes are breathing when they're not running. So allowing them to train their inspiratory muscles. So that would be the first thing I would focus on.
Can I just jump in for a quick question
Yeah.
about that? So when you're saying getting the diaphragm and the intercostals mobilized, you're taking deliberately fuller, slower breaths. So you're actually it's almost like full lung capacity and out rather than light breathing. You're deliberately
Well, there'll be two ways of doing it. So the first one, because from a sensation point of view, I think it's more effective. So I would tell people, if you can buy TheraBand, so you put a band around your waist, hands on that, very deliberately breathing in as full as you can through your nose. And then to make sure you get a full exhale, counting from 1 to 10 as quickly as you can. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, until you do that. That forces your diaphragm to properly empty as much as you can. And this is something that Caws used to do. And you get that physical sensation that you're not going to get from the same. You can feel it with your hands, but if you've got something that's elastic, that's wrapped around just underneath the base of your ribs, you can sense it going up. And actually, you're trying to push it out, and then you're allowing it to then sink back in.
And it's an active exhale or a passive exhale?
In between. It's not completely passive because you're counting.
Right, yeah.
But it's not active because you're not forcing it.
Right.
Actually, what's forcing it is if you've got the TheraBand around your waist, that's kind of forcing it in. And counting is ensuring that you've got that focus to get as. One of the things that Stowe discovered is, and this is a problem with runners, is when they get tired, you don't exhale properly. So then you're not inhaling because your diaphragm, you can get hyperinflated ribs. So your diaphragm isn't actually, it's all dead air. You're breathing air into your lungs and out. It's not going down. It's not getting down here. And if you can't inhale properly, you're not going to be able to inhale fully if you can't exhale fully. Because if your diaphragm's kind of not gone back to the place it needs to inhale, your lungs are filled by your diaphragm going down and your intercostals coming up. And if you're just using all this to try and pull it up, it's a lot more stressful and it's not as effective. So that would be something that I would suggest athletes can do from a physical point of view before they run. It's not going to be the first thing I get them to do, but it might be if I've worked with somebody for 3 to 4 months, then I can go to that because I've generally got buy-in by that time because they've seen the running's improved. The other thing that I would also do is then reduce breathing, because that's good for your breathing mechanics full stop. And good breathing mechanics is good for everything and really, really for running. The problem with breathe slow, breathe low is I personally find it the hardest breathing technique to manage. And I think most people do. And it takes a really long time to kind of actually do this. And this is something that I've heard Leo talk about this a couple of times. It's not something I would go to straight away with runners. Asthmatics, people with any kind of obstructions, general health, I think it's really, really key. But I think runners are going to find it too much of a slow burn to do that, maybe for the first 6 months, unless they're really keen. But that's what I found. If they're not going to sit there and do lots of that, they're more likely to do the inhale, exhale, because they've got that physical sense of what they're doing. Then you've got running itself. So in terms of running itself, now I know that, Gray, you use breathing gears. I think there's efficacy in them and I like them. I personally choose not to use them myself. Or I have two, I have two breathing gears for when you're running. One all through your nose and one have your mouth open, because there comes a point in time where you need to shift air quickly. And actually, I think you're going to lose everyone you work with. And I'm not suggesting you don't say this, that you should never run with your mouth open. The only athlete I know who did this was Sonia Richards-Ross, who won the 400 meters in London in 2012, who she would always breathe through her nose. But I would say to everybody that I work with, right, the majority of your running is done through your nose, but you introduce it as maybe 5 minutes in the middle of a set, 10 minutes. So if they're going to run for half an hour, you tell them only, right, do 5 minutes in the middle, don't do more, just do that. And then you build it up a little bit every time that they do a greater run. It's really good for slower running, because generally if you're running on your own, you haven't got a partner to talk to check that you can talk to them. So that conversational pace, which keeps you steady. So this is something that I get mixed. What's that? I can't remember the word when people do stuff. Anyway,
Feedback.
I get a mixed response to it. Yeah. So if I'm doing a track session, people will always do it because I'm on the track with them. So they're kind of, because I'm there as a coach, they're going to do it. But if they're off running on their own, and actually I said, this is the most important thing that you can do in most of your running, just breathe through your nose. And especially when it's getting colder, you'll get people complaining about their throat. Well, if you breathe through your nose, it's warmed, it's humidified, and you're not taking as big a breath, irritating your throat, doesn't hurt as much. And so I breathe through my nose unless I'm doing anything harder all the time. And in winter, the only time I get aggravation is if I'm doing track, interval work, my throat always hurts because I'm like, well, I'm breathing through my mouth. But that's something I do try and push, but I only try and push hard with that, again, if I've done a marathon cycle with somebody and they're like, right, what do we do next? And I've got that buy-in. I always write it into programs. I'll talk about it, but I won't be too draconian on it because, again, I think that people have to start coming to it themselves. So that's pure nose breathing for anything that's under a pace that I would say is 6 out of 10. So anything that is marathon pace or just above marathon pace and slower, which is most of the running that people are going to do. The other thing that I would then encourage people to do if they wanted to challenge themselves a little bit more, because this is a transition into doing the really quite hard breath holds, is, and Patrick talks about this, is in and out through your nose, hold your breath for 5 steps or 3 steps, whichever they're more comfortable with. Do that for a period of time or a distance, and then increase it. So what I will do before an interval or a track session is the last kilometre. So if they're doing a 3K warm-up or a 15-minute warm-up, I'll say the last 5 minutes or the last K, you're going to split it in 2. You're going to do the first 2.5 minutes, breath hold for 5 steps, 3 breaths through your nose, breath hold for 5 steps. It's working your diaphragm, it's working your intercostals, it's pushing oxygen into your muscles. The increased CO2 warms everything up. 2.5 minutes or 500 meters, you then switch to double the steps. So if you're doing 3 steps, you do 6. If you're doing 4, you do 8. I personally do 5 and 10. That's my choice. Some athletes want 3 and 6 because it's easier for them. You then get yourself, and that's almost like this place from going from nasal breathing to nasal breathing and breath holds, doing something just before you want to then maybe start a more aggressive breath hold, such as shark fit, where it's in and out through your nose, hold your breath, walk, jog, run, stride, 5 short sips of air through your breath, 30 seconds nasally if you can. Some people, they want to in through the nose, out through the mouth. Repeat that, do 5 of those. Now, I have yet to meet a runner who hasn't done that, who then doesn't set off on the first thing that they're doing and it feels really easy and they're going a lot faster than they want to. So you have to say, look, you need to slow down because this is going to last you for 2 minutes. It's a really nice way to set off. But that always gets great buy-in because everyone finishes it and they feel a bit lightheaded. The legs might feel a bit heavy, and you're like, where's this going? And then they start, and it's like, wow, this is really easy. So it's helpful to explain that that's going to be the impact before they start running. But that's always the one I get the most buy-in to, because it's always the one where you get that immediate, this is great.
Kevin,
Yes.
sorry, that was really interesting. Do you mind just saying that again? Sorry, I've got a noise in the background. Do you mind what was it, five steps? Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I'll put a link. So I've got running tools on my website. I'll put a link in the chat to all of these that you can use. And they're not mine, they're Patrick's. I've just given them one word names because I just think it's easy for me to remember them. So the last 5 minutes or kilometer, whichever and I'm saying 5 minutes because roughly that's most of the guys that I train, that's what they're doing for a K, for a warm-up. You divide that last 5 minutes or kilometer into 2 sections. The first half of it, you do 3-step, 4-step, 5-step breath holds, whatever, something that they can manage. It's not hard. They can do it. They're not pulling for breath. They're not straining for breath. They're up. Oh, this is fine. This is okay. I would start with 3 and then move to 5. I mean, I do 5 because that's my preference.
And that is running. You're running, you're not going into
yeah, you're right. So if I was doing, for example, if I was doing a track session, so I was doing something where they might be doing 10 400s, I'll say, right, 15-minute warm-up, 3K warm-up. So you're doing, that would be 7.5 laps of the track. So they've done 10 minutes. I'm like, right, okay, the next 500 meters. So that warm-up, all nasal. So they've done 10 minutes, all nasal breathing, because they've got no one else to talk to check that they're running at the right speed. That first 2.5 minutes, I'll be like, right, you're going to breathe in and out through your nose. You're going to hold your breath for 5 steps. Then you get to the second half, or the second 500 meters, you're going to hold your breath for twice as long. So if you're doing 5 steps, now you're going to do 10 steps. When you've reached those steps, you take 3 breaths. 3 breaths. You don't force them. You just let 3 breaths. Now, the first one, the 5 steps, the breaths are easy. The second one, they're harder because you've built up more CO2. You're moving. Your diaphragm's been. It is harder, and mentally, it's harder. But it's important. I think it's really, really important to do it. So then you might find the first breath is really quick. The second breath is kind of a little bit less forced. And the third breath, just as you feel a bit more relaxed, you have to go into the hold again. So you finish that. Now, I would then, if I was going to do any mobility drills around feet, ankles, knees, so I like doing something, they're called dribbles. So you put your foot down and you roll it through and you come up on your toes and then you put the other foot down. So you do that. I do jumps. I'll do lunges with stretching the psoas. So something Gary Ward, a slightly different lunge. I might take some, and then running through mini wickets, which is really good for form. I'll do all of that before I then do the very aggressive breath holds. I do the aggressive breath holds directly before the session starts. It will be the last thing I do as part of a warm-up, because what you lose, if you did that before you did the drills, it would lose all of the impact of building up that CO2, pushing the oxygen into the muscles. It will just dissipate. So there is no point doing that if you want to use it before you start the session. If you don't use it directly before the first set. So you could be doing a threshold session. You might be running 3 minutes on, 2 minutes off for half an hour. You do it just before you started that. Is that helpful? Great. Then if I'm doing intervals, one of the things I would encourage people to do is quickly as possible is, if it's a really hard interval and there's a walking break, which I generally stay away from, but if you're doing hills, you might need to do this. I'll try and get them to do physiological size, which is you take the weight, you basically stand, hands on your knees. This is something Gray's talked about. He knows this from Qigong. If you take So if I was going to stand up, hands on my knees, bend over, then my diaphragm isn't having to do any postural stability. It can just purely focus on breath. You take 2 inhales through your nose and 1 slow exhale through your mouth. So if any of you are familiar with Andrew Huberman, he talks about it. It's a physiological sign. Children, when they're crying, it soothes you. So's your heart rate. First inhale pushes open the air sacs. Second inhale gets the oxygen in low. Long exhale blows off the excess CO2. Long exhale slows your heart rate down. You want to bring your heart rate down. You want to get oxygen in. You want to get the excess CO2 out. 5, 6 of those. That will calm people down. And then I'll try to encourage them as quickly as possible, just nasally breathing. It might be that they need still, but I'll be like, no breathing in through your mouth. I'm really militant on this. You do not breathe in through your mouth when you recover, because it's just going to get, you're going to get short breaths. It's going to lift them up. You want to get them to calm down. If they're doing that quickly, so they might be doing 100-meter strides. I'll be encouraging them on the walk back to try to do breath holds for steps as well, if they haven't worked so hard. Because what I want them to do is calm down, but equally, I want oxygen pushed into the muscles. And the way you're going to do that is by building up CO2 so it can swap with oxygen. And athletes will, it's like you've got a train, it carries oxygen and CO2 on carriages, they swap. So you want the CO2 to get off, you want the oxygen to go on, and it goes back to your heart and you get rid of it. And yeah, we'll come back to your question. So that will be within intervals. Then, so that's running when you're actually running, so during the run itself. Post-run, the best thing that I think that any runner can do is cadence breathing, coherence breathing, where you are regulating your nervous system. So you've put your nervous system under stress. Now the body doesn't know whether you've been running or you've had a bad phone call, or whatever, you're stressed. So I use an app called the Breathing app, which there's a guy called Eddie Stearns in the US who's taught yoga for years. He developed it. It's free. You breathe in through your nose for a count. Could be 5, could be 6. I like 6, and you breathe out for the same count. Now, I tell people do this for 10 minutes. I do it with the kids at the end of the running sessions that we've done, because it will tell your body, it will tell your nervous system that you're going from sympathetic to parasympathetic. You'll bring everything down. I actually feel within 3 breaths, I'll feel calm. I actually have a mantra where I say, just let go. So every 2 seconds. And I like listening to the tone. I've yet to find somebody who does this, who doesn't find it really, really peaceful. Now, the reason I think this is so key, and it's the most important thing for any harder session, is your nervous system has been really ramped up. And the best way to get a nervous system to calm down is by using the breath. It's the single most critical way of doing it. And the best way of doing that is by using the breath in a way that your body recognizes, oh, your heart rate starts tuning in with your breath. Everything starts calming down. So whilst it's not going to immediately reduce DOMS, or if you've been injured, it's not going to heal an injury. But what it is going to do is it's allow your body to regulate, which means all of those healing mechanisms, your ability to sleep, your ability to recover, they're going to be able to kick in a lot faster, which is why it's the one thing I'm like, okay, so if I want somebody to do something away from the track, it will be do this. And the way I introduce it is you go into a shower, you're in the shower for 2 minutes, do it when you're in the shower. A really nice one is if people have got the time, you get them to lie. It's a yoga pose. I can't remember. Somebody might know what it's called. You lie with your legs up straight against the wall like that. And I'll get them to do it then. It's really nice. Because that empties your lymph glands as well. So it takes all the waste away. So that's the one thing that I think is really, really the most important out of everything, to be honest. So I'm going to look at the question Andy asked me. Those things between breaths, I've also been no count, just what they can manage. Yeah, and you'll find actually, so Andy wants to know the speed of the breathing in between the breath holds. When you're doing 10-step breath hold, you can't really think about time. You just want to breathe. And my belief is you want to kind of make, or what I found is you want to make this as accessible as possible for people, because there's a runner that I work with who's a really good age. She's one of the best female age group runners, V50s, and she started working with me, and I just gave her too much, and it just put her off, in all honesty. And it's not to say that any of the things I was giving her weren't going to work. They were. But if you want somebody to improve, I mean, I think about this myself. I benefited by taking something, working with it, really. So I started nasal breathing as the first thing I did with my running. And I did that for 6 months to 9 months. And that was, and then I was like, oh, wow, that works really well. I'm finding I'm running a lot quicker than like 30 seconds a kilometer from when I started doing it. What else can I do? And in my enthusiasm, when I work with people, I kind of forget about that. And I think, okay, look at all these different things you can do. And that can blind people, as I've learned. So, yes, I've talked a lot.
Good.
I like to talk.
Feel
Has
free.
anyone got any other questions they'd like to
There's
ask
a
me?
few running coaches in here I can see, so I'm sure they're going to chip in a minute as well. Do you use heart rate monitors or train heart rate zones at all? Or are you just going breath?
No. I personally don't like training with heart rate. Because if you haven't got a strap, it's a waste of time. This is not going to, there's so much noise with wristwatch heart rate, they're rubbish. My watch told me this morning my heart rate was 180, which was bollocks. It wasn't. I know it wasn't. I know it was like under 140. The other problem with heart rate training, I think, is that for trends, it's really valuable. So, for example, I know my watch is wrong, but I know it's always wrong. So actually, I can look at the trend it's showing me. So actually, I think trends with heart rate are valuable. But I think in running, so if I go out running tomorrow and it's really hot, my heart rate's going to be kicking up because of the heat. And I think that your heart rate as well, if you're doing marathon training, you get creep. And actually, if you want people to train to run for a time 42K and they're only focused on their heart rate, well, they're not going to be able to train at the speed when they get to the back end because their heart rate is going to have risen too much. And if they're thinking, oh, I need it to be 150 and it goes to 170, they're perfectly safe for within what they can do. But they're not training because they're obsessed with this heart rate and bringing it down to a certain point. So I think in the moment for training, for me, feel and pace are really important. So the guy I was running with today, he was in South America in August, and he did a 38K run in Brazil, and he finished, and he was running slower than like about 30 seconds a K, but his heart rate was up. And I was like, look, forget your heart rate. How did that feel? He said, well, harder than I normally would. And I was like, well, it's that kind of effort. We know. I think the best indicator of how we run is how we feel. And actually we should listen to ourselves. So that's my personal view on heart rate. Long-term trends, but day-to-day training, I'm not really a fan of it.
I was quite shocked because I use heart rate monitor, and my heart rate monitor ran out as I was doing a run the other day. So I put it onto the wrist monitor, wrist one, so it's Garmin, and it was completely like you. It was up at like 160, and I'm like, there's no way it's up there at 160. So if I'd have been training to the wrist monitor and not had other stuff to monitor it by or measure it by, then yeah, it can be a little bit not accurate.
Oh, and I don't like wearing a strap, which is why, that's my preference again. But I know there's lots of people. So Phil Maffetone's method of using your heart rate zone to do training, and I know there's a lot of efficacy in it, and I know a lot of people do swear by it, and for them it works great. It's just not something that I would encourage for the people that I work with. I wouldn't discourage them if they wanted to. I'd be like, fine. But it's not something I would write into. I don't ever write it into training programs. I tend to be pace and effort. And if I first start working with someone, I won't talk about pace. I'll be like, right, 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10. Otherwise, if you start giving people paces, you're either going to push them too hard, or you're going to put a ceiling on where they can go. And if you talk about effort and they don't focus on looking at their watch, then actually they're going to run to where their body is at that point in time, which I think is a far better way. And especially if you're doing nasal breathing, it's like, well, the pace is irrelevant. You run so you can nasally breathe, and you want to look at the pace afterwards, fine, but please don't look at it whilst you're running, because it's just going to get in your head.
And when you're giving them a pace, so would that be on the track, or would you give them a pace if they're outdoors, and the terrain is varied and stuff?
It depends on where they're running. So if you're doing anything that's trail, mountain, pace is, forget it. Go out and run for 3 hours. You know, I don't care what the pace is. You know, if you walk, if you need to walk, yeah. It's impossible to know. Like if I go down to Westgate and I'm running on the seafront, so I was doing 500 meter sets, and it was 7 seconds, going one way quicker than the other. So it's like you run to feel. If it was consistent what they were doing, and it's road marathons, I would give them a paces. If I know that they understand pace. So one of the guys who's running Berlin this weekend, he doesn't get pace, because he's only just come to running. So there's pointless me telling him paces. I'm like, you need to run to feel. There's a guy who's running London next week who will potentially run like low 240s. He's really tuned into pace. So yes, I do give him pace because he knows what it feels like. So I think that pace is a distraction for people who don't understand it. It's a massive distraction, and it's really unhelpful. And I would rather, so with the kids I coach, I don't talk about paces with them unless I know that they're able to manage speeding up and slowing down with the subtleties between 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10, 7. Otherwise, it's just a distraction.
No, that's a good point. Interesting. How did you get involved in running in the first place? So what's your story into becoming a runner?
So when I was at school, when I was at secondary school in Old Money, in first year of secondary, which is now year 7, I remember watching the Olympics in '84 and seeing Zola Budd run barefoot, and I was inspired. So I ran in my school sports day the 1500 meters in barefoot, and I won. And I was so excited. I think my mum thought it was mad, but I was gutted because the teachers went on strike, so there was no district sports that year, and I would have represented my school. I was furious, and I've been, you know, as a teacher now, I completely understand why teachers make those decisions. But I kind of then ran at school. We moved from London to Canterbury. The school I went to wasn't particularly sporty. I went to university. You know, I played a bit of football. I came away from running. I started running again in around 2002, I would say. Nike started doing 10Ks. I ran New York, really enjoyed that. And then only properly came, and then kind of played with it a little bit. Came back to, and then had a break, started running again more seriously in 2017. I ran Berlin in 2018, and I ran Berlin 3 minutes slower than I ran New York, which had been 18 years previously, and I was 18 years older. So I was like, ooh. And I just found, I mean, the thing that got me back into running actually was when I started teaching. I'd stopped running and I ran, and I found it, I couldn't believe I'd stopped, because it just was my place I could go to kind of just switch off and just not think about my day for however long I ran for. So that's how I got back into it, and I love it.
I was just going to say, so the love of running, and that sort of like that obvious natural skill, and then the fact that, like you say, is you have to enjoy it, because you can't put yourself, there's a lot easier things to do to put yourself through if you don't actually enjoy doing it. Do you
Yeah,
sorry, go
it is, but I like I mean, if I'm honest, I've been injured a lot over the last 18 months, which is mainly my own fault. But whilst I love marathons, I like the longer marathon sessions. So I like going out and doing a really hard. I like running at that pace. So a half marathon is my perfect distance because you can run quite hard for a long time. It's not like anything below that hurts really quickly. So if you're doing a 5K or a 10K, you're in pain from like 3/4. You get to 3/4. And a marathon, you are a half. It's like, well, 10-mile run. That's the sweet spot for me because it's something that you feel good, you feel quick, and you can carry it on. So that's what I really enjoy running.
10 miles is a really nice, and there's very few 10 mile. I'm raced for a while, and bizarrely, I'm hopefully doing a half marathon on Sunday for the first time in a long time, a race. But there's very few 10-mile races, and that is a really nice distance. I've done a couple of those, which I've really enjoyed a while back.
Has anybody else got any other questions they would like to ask me?
No, you must have questions. The type of clients you're working with sound as if they're pretty sort of like top good runners. Do you deliberately look for runners who are at the more sort of elite level, or do you work with?
No, so I've probably got a bit more of a mix. I mean, I've got two guys who are, I mean, they're good for their age. So, but they're not sub-elite. I mean, these guys are just over sort of 3 hours to 3:20, which is not shabby. It's good times for marathons, but in terms of like, there's still a world of difference with getting further down. I've got one guy who's doing Berlin who will probably do it in 4.5 hours, which is a lot. I would say is probably where most people are with the running. And then I do the juniors, which as I said, I love because you work with children in terms of their movement patterns, and so that I find really interesting. And also how they're going to take breath to running and how they're going to how they do it. So I've had two of the boys recently having breathing problems when they've been running. So either exercise-induced asthma, which is exercise-induced bronchoconstriction, or something else, which would be exercise-induced laryngeal obstruction, which is slightly different. So thinking about giving them techniques and shifting their training to help manage their feeling, they're really, really inspiring to work with because they'll take it on board, they'll go away, they'll do it, they tell me what works, they tell me so I learn a lot from working with them. I am happy I'll work with anybody who wants to run. I mean, I really enjoy working with, if I was going to choose somebody to work with, it would be runners who were running really well. But it's just seeing the improvement, to be honest. So watching somebody just get better and better and better, I find that really inspiring as well.
I think from a point of view of working with kids, I think that they're so lucky to have a coach like yourself, because how many, I mean, you must know you've worked with you've seen other teachers and things, but how many of other coaches are going to give them the quality of coaching that you're doing and the understanding of the breath and everything. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I have seen a few this kind of idea of you're getting kids to do a strength circuit and you're counting down and you start counting up and all this sort of stuff, which I'm like, no, just do it, count. And there's that kind of slightly old school, oh, we're really hard, we're really tough on them, but no, we're lovable. And I'm like, look, kids just see through it. But then that comes from teaching, because I've taught for long enough. So
mouth tape question.
Okay. So I don't talk about mouth taping with juniors. Now, the reason that I don't talk about mouth taping with juniors, I take my mouth when I sleep, and I have done for a long time. And I do talk about that with some of the athletes I work with. But my mum is a really good example of why I am careful in talking about this. And I think that mouth taping is challenging to introduce because it speaks to quite a primal fear for lots of people, where they just think they can't breathe. So it's the way it's delivered. And actually, I did a running session with Darren Finn, the guy who wrote Way of the Runner, and really nice guy. Did a really good session at Hampstead Heath with a running coach he's got called Joe Kelly. And Joe really knows his stuff, and he's a great coach. And they wanted people to run with their mouths closed, and so they gave them a bit of tape. And when I first started running and only nasally breathing, I had a mouth guard that this guy in the States I was working with had made up, and I would run with this mouth guard in. We don't need to tape our mouth or block our mouth to run and only nasally breathe. And actually, I think it's just a barrier that's going to stop people from doing it. So I don't talk about it because we don't need to do it.
Yeah, sorry, I meant overnight, Kevin. No, I wouldn't do it during the day either. Sorry, I was meaning overnight.
Yeah, so I have done and I do, but again, so my mum, high blood pressure, I brought it down with some stuff. She was like, what else can I do? And I said, well, the best thing you can do is to encourage your mouth to remain closed at night by putting the piece of tape on it. And she adamantly doesn't want to do it because she puts the fear of God into it. And I said, well, that's the best thing for you to do at this point in time with the other stuff you're doing. So I said, do it during the day. Practice a little bit where you can take it off and then you can see you're not sealing your mouth. But I did, so for June, one of the reasons I used it, actually, I think it's great for health benefits. I think, I do talk about it, but maybe not just for running. I just think if you know that you snore and you know that your sleep's not great, then I think it's something that you really should experiment with. My wife's best friend, her 2 kids used to have problems wetting the bed, and so she bought the tape from Patrick, and that's had a really positive impact because it affects vasopressin being released, which I know it's with adults, and I was like, well, maybe it'll work with kids as well. So the right time in your breath journey, there isn't a right, whenever. So Andy wants to know, is there a right time to do it at night? If you wake up and you don't feel rested from your sleep and you think, I've been in bed for 7 or 8 hours, you're not sleeping well. If your mouth is dry, if you've got that sensation that you just feel a bit groggy, then the chances are you'll sleep, unless you did something really stressful before you went to bed, and that's had an impact on how you sleep. I would say that you pretty much, people know whether they've slept well or not. I think that you trust people, they're going to tell you. And getting them to then try with a bit of tape over their mouth. I also say, look, it took me, I regularly wake up and the tape's on my cheek or on my back or it's in the bed. It's like, I've just pulled it off. And there's different, like the current tape I've got is rubbish. It just comes off really easy, but there's other 3M tape is a lot better. And it took me a while to find the perfect kind of little bit to just put over my mouth. But yes, I do. And I do suggest that people do it. But I see this as a kind of a general piece of health advice for people to use, rather than just specific to running, if that answers your question.
Brilliant, that's excellent. We're coming towards the end of the session. I hesitate to ask this question because every time Kevin and I get together, it always costs me a fortune because he advises on all these fantastic books to read. Do you have any sort of reading suggestions? I know you said you've got your website and you'll send us a link to the resources on there, but anything in particular, perhaps maybe 1 or 2 books, podcasts?
Leo Ryan's really, so looking up Leo Ryan, any podcast he's done, I'll see if I can find that now. Do you want me to email you these links so you can send them on, because I can see.
Yeah, or if you've just got that. I mean, what's the best way for people need to get in contact with you? Can maybe just pop your...
I'll put my website up the way. I'm going to find the running tools. There we go. There's the running tools one.
Just stick it in the
yeah, there it is. So that's running tools. In terms of books to read around breath, Alison McConnell. So Alison McConnell's book is a really good book in terms of focusing on inspiratory muscle trainers. And I've just read the breathing. I'm getting a couple of them because I can't remember what.
Anybody else got any questions? Because we finished.
I have a quick question. I used this. I got it from Patrick's website. I'll just throw it up to my camera. I use that for running, and I put that up my nose, and I don't breathe through my. I just, I don't have to use my mouth at all. So I've done up in 30, 40 kilometers, no problem. Have you used these at all?
I haven't, no, because I am quite confident, because I've been doing this for a long time now. I'm confident breathing purely through my mouth, through my nose, sorry. So I know that there will be devices such as that work, and I think they're a good starting point for people. But equally, I quite like the fact of not having anything. I like just being able to keep my mouth shut and run. And if that works for you, I think that's brilliant. And stick with it, or maybe try without it occasionally as well, and see how does it feel. Am I able to do that?
I think it focuses my thought to breathe through my nose, because when I feel it there, it's just like it's there, so I'll use it type of thing. And then like I've sort of nearly to remind myself to breathe through my mouth.
Yeah.
So I got so I started doing that, and I suppose since I started breathing through my nose, I got a lot faster times this year. And personal bests.
That's
after
really nice to know.
10, 12 years running.
Shows it works.
Yes, well, I suppose it's a combination of a few things as well. I'm starting to try and introduce more Tai Chi running back into my running as well. So I'm sort of reading into that with leaning a bit forward and sort of looking into that again, sort of rereading some of the books. But again, like I do the breathing exercises ever since I started that course with yourself, like 15 minutes every day. Actually, I sometimes do it after a long run in a sauna. Now, I don't know if that's a good idea, doing 15-minute breathing exercise in a sauna, but I haven't passed out yet.
As long as you feel okay, that's that would be great. Brilliant. We're going to have to finish there because it's coming up to the hour. Kevin, really appreciate your information there. So important for people to understand that. Maybe we can arrange another one another time, because I'm sure there'll be loads more questions coming up. And thank everyone else for joining, and have a fantastic weekend, and hopefully catch you all very soon. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Enjoy the weekend.
Thanks.